Begins with understanding and talking about the colonial impact on Papua New Guinea's economy from 1884 to 1945. Okay, from that period alone, from 1884 to 1949, or 45 rather. We are going to examine the plantation economic development and the consequence of the colonial rule. Why is this important? During the time when Papua New Guinea was discovered, okay, the forces of international politics, they were after raw materials as a result of industrialization in the 17th century, and hence plantation economy was the focus of the global economy. Okay? So within that period and that environment in the global politics gave rise to the study of political economy, and hence Papua New Guinea politics, and the study of it is situated within this context here. So we will look at the plantation system and the colonial policies in Papua New Guinea from 1884 to 1945. And you all know what the date 1945 leads us to, World War II. Now the objectives here, there are about 3 objectives. And these 3 objectives here sort of summarize the readings that is already uploaded. So the first reading, the plantation system or the plantation economy. Okay, if you read through the reading here, what I did was I sort of break that reading down into lecture format and discussion format for us to discuss. So there are 3 themes discussed in the reading here. Number 1 is to understand the idea of primitive accumulation. Okay, this is an important word. What is primitive accumulation? And secondly, the periphery argument and its application in the plantation system. So 2 important words here. Primitive accumulation, what constitutes primitive accumulation, and what is the periphery. Okay, the periphery argument. Okay, that's the first objective of this lecture. The second is, after trying to understand the primitive accumulation, or what constitutes defined primitive accumulation, and what is the periphery argument, then we use those 2 tools to understand and describe the features of plantation systems in the territory of Papua and the territory of New Guinea. Okay? So first we are to discuss a framework in which we try to understand what the hell is going on in Papua and New Guinea territory from 1884 to 1945. Now, what is primitive accumulation? Okay, primitive accumulation simply comes from the study of Marxism. And Marxism talks about the different class system, and those different class system tends to benefit those upper class, the bourgeoisies, at the cost of the lower class. So economics, so to speak. But what primitive accumulation is basically defined as, in the primitive sense of that word, disposition by capitalists. So for example, in the early days of the 17th century, the capitalist system, where you have, let's say, the British coming into India, took over the land, exploit the land, grow crops, tobacco, and then ship back to Europe to sell. Okay, at the expense or not properly compensating the indigenous of theirs or the Indians. Okay, so that's an example of wealth by disposition. Okay, and these forms exist today in various, let's say, in various themes and various ideas. For example, Now you have large multinational companies operating in Papua New Guinea today. Take, for instance, the mining sectors, where you have the government and the state is at the mercy of those large multinational companies. Where they come in, they negotiate terms that are unequal, okay, and they not compensating not compensating the landowners properly and the state, okay. So unequal treaties in economics. So basically, primitive accumulation talks about the idea of capitalist system in such a way that it exploits land at the benefits of those multinational corporations. Now, in that idea, it leads us to this second point here. What primitive accumulation is basically unequal exchange of goods, of products, okay? The exchange of products of unequal value. So for example, a plantation system in India where they recruit labor, they will pay those laborers at the lower wage, okay, at the expense of those labor producing, let's say, tobacco, and then they will sell those tobacco at a higher value price, okay? So in that there is an unequal exchange of transaction. Now if you look at most of, okay, let's say for example, when multinational companies coming in to extract natural resources from Papua New Guinea, our government, because they don't have the necessary technology and knowledge, they are bound to go along with the multinational corporation, because the multinational corporation has advantage over knowledge and technology. So you can imagine the transaction, it will be unequal in terms of economic benefits. So the idea of primitive accumulation speaks about this unequal exchange of or transaction of economics or economic commodities. Now, in Papua New Guinea, it took a different tone, okay? Now, Papua New Guinea's case, in this whole idea of primitive accumulation, and we will go through, is that the Germans came in, and even the Australians, the multinational companies in Australia during the time, were having trouble in establishing plantation system or plantations in Papua New Guinea. First of all, they were having issues with shortage of land and labor. You look at Papua New Guinea, you look at the islands, you look at the coastal regions, there is, okay, issues or challenges of land. Okay, there is no arable land, okay, enough to have a, let's say, massive agricultural or plantation development during the time. So two forces, the shortage of land and the labor shortage, affected the plantation economy in Papua New Guinea. Okay, and we'll find out how that also affects the overall structural economy of Papua and New Guinea when it after 1945. So basically, what primitive accumulation talks about is the unequal exchange of value in economic productivity. Okay? And if you look at it, it's basically exploitation. So that's primitive accumulation, where you have big companies coming in. So when you read about the chapters, you will notice that there is a lot of talks about companies, let's say transaction figures, money amounts. Okay? It's trying to explain this idea of primitive accumulation, or the idea of unequal exchange of value. Now, the idea of primitive accumulation will lead to the next important discussion, and that is about the periphery argument, or the periphery. If you're coming from a public policy background, you might have covered this in IDS, Introduction to Development Studies, where you talk about the dependency theory. Now, the center periphery argument is part of what is called the dependency theory. Now, how does that work, or how do we understand this center periphery argument? Center periphery argument revolves around two important items: capital and labor, and the relationship between two different countries. Now, for example, you have here the big, let's say, circle here. The British represents British Empire. At the center, okay. Outside the center, you have the periphery. So the center is always the developed industrial center, or industrial country, or developed country. The periphery is the outer, okay, system. Now, example would be the center depends on the periphery for its economic existence. So, for example, the textile industries in Britain, they depended much on the production in India. So if you look at the center is Britain, and the periphery is India, in terms of looking at textile industry. Now, because India cannot produce the textile, they don't have the technology, okay, the factories. What India does is that India cultivates, okay, the raw materials. India cultivates the raw materials, and India sells it or sends it over to Britain, where Britain manufactures the raw materials, and then Britain sells it in the international market. Now, this exchange, the very existence of that relationship, is what primitive accumulation is talking about, the unequal exchange of that value. Now, in that case, in that example, now that makes India dependent mostly on Britain for its economic development. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So, coming back to our example here, or coming back to our story, remember, New Zealand and Australia, they are firstly called settler colonies. If it wasn't for New Zealand and Australia, the Pacific would not be discovered. Okay? Maybe later, up until the 19th century or the 20th century. But because of Australia and New Zealand, okay, Papua New Guinea, part of the Pacific Island countries, okay, were forced into the global politics or the international politics. So here we have Britain, or the British Empire, and you have other settler colonies. Australia and New Zealand is part of that settler colonies. Now, you have the small circles here. Both of them represent Australia. Okay? One is Sydney and the other one is Queensland. Okay? So, remember, the periphery depends depends on the center for its economic existence. So, when Australia and New Zealand are settler colonies, they depend on British for development, economic development. It was not until 1901 when Australia got its independence. So, what is called, and I put here, the merchant capital. So the relationship between Australia and Britain, okay, revolves around these relations, revolves around the economic development, okay? So the periphery depends on the center for economic development. But here is that you will see that the ultra periphery This is outside of the relationship here. That is where Papua is, and later New Guinea. It's not within this relationship here or within this boundary here. Okay? So example, British provide sufficient capital, money, technology to Australia. Australia, what it does is provide labor, okay? And then brings off the raw materials back to Britain. And that relationship is strengthened through Britain's support in economic development of its settler colony. So where do you think Papua fits in? Papua territory was outside of that relationship. So when it comes to periphery, center periphery argument, to begin with, Papua was not within the relationship, the center periphery relationship. And this is, and it's as a result of this, and even today we are seeing this relationship played out in terms of economic trade. But we'll come to that a little bit later. I'll give you an example, okay, before we talk about Papua. Let's talk about the sugar industry, for example. Okay, Queensland is a plantation economy during those times, and Queensland produced sugar and other agricultural products. Britain buys off sugar from Queensland, okay, or Australia. So when you have that sugar being produced by Queensland and sell it off to Britain, how is establishing another sugar plantation in Papua benefiting Queensland? This will create competition and will affect Queensland's economy. So there's no use, or it's not, let's say, economically or cost benefit or economically wise to establish a sugar plantation in Papua region. If you look at that example, okay, that is the reason why you will not see a lot of plantations in the Papua region from 1884 to 1945. It comes back to this relationship here. Okay, now let's look at how primitive accumulation, together with the center periphery argument, affect the growth of Papua and New Britain from 1884 to 1945. Now, in your reading, it will say, in that subsection title, it would be, okay, the territory of Papua, a lethargic case. So within that subsection, the reading will talk about, number one, the lack of capital investment. Number two, uncertainty in defining economic policy. And number three, the Australian mercantile system. Why is there a lack of capital investment in the Papua region? The reason being that most of the capital investment have been going to Australia, okay? And as a result, there is lack of capital investment in the Papua area, or the Papua region. Okay, let's look at some examples here. Okay, you have about 3-4 dates here. 1884. Around 1884, you have small settler or small white community or white settler community established, okay, both in the territories of Papua and New Guinea. From 1884, let's say, to 1907, during that period, there was an interest or gold discovery that, okay, make or the gold discovery attracted most of those white settlers, okay, coming from Australia and even Britain. So these were prospective gold, let's say, miners. Prospective in a sense that, okay, they came here looking for gold, okay? They did not come here to build up trade stores and build up plantations. Okay? In the current form, you have prospecting licenses given by the Department of Petroleum Energy, I believe. These are prospecting, let's say, exploration licenses, where they are given license to come and check whether there is an abundance in deposit or not. If there's no deposit, then they'll pack up and leave. So prospective licenses are given to them. It doesn't mean that they will come and establish a company here so that locals will be employed. No. So in the same sense, we have prospecting gold, let's say, companies coming in, but these are small scale. After 1907, okay, 19th century to 1905, what did I put there? Lack of agriculture or peasant base. So when you have prospective gold explorers coming in, okay, the environment of Papua region plus the gold rush during that era has made it in such a way that there is no interest in any agricultural productivity. Why agriculture? Okay, in political economy, in politics, agriculture is very important because that is the basis of any modernizing economy. They started from agriculture and then you go to manufacturing industries. And here, Papua region was struggling to at least have its foundation established. Its foundation was disturbed as a result of Queensland economy and was disturbed as a result of gold prospectus. Okay? The same reason why our government is focused on extractive industry and not agriculture. This is a part dependency issue here. Why? Because gold and extractive industry will have, in a short period of time, as a maximum return of investment, not agriculture. So when the gold rush of the 19th century came in, affected agricultural economy. So here, during that time, the economy was mainly exporting pearl shells, beach timber, sandalwood, okay, small scale exports, but not that massive, okay? Absence or lack of any agricultural development. Now here, early 20th century, 1901 to 1934, okay? We have Australian companies, Benz Phillip, steamships. Okay. Now these shipping companies have monopoly over the trade routes in Papua. And by 1929, you have 1929, you have the Great Economic Depression, which again affected any agricultural or plantation development in Papua region. So the reason why we are having issues with, or the reason why there is lack of agricultural or plantation development in Papua region, okay, was because of these structural issues here. Number one, the position of Australia, especially the Queensland economy. Number two, okay, Papua New Guinea's ecological environment. And number three is the gold prospects of the early 19th century and the late 19th century that made it difficult for any agricultural investment to take place. Okay, let's look at the next theme, which is uncertainty in defining economic policy. Now again here, Australia, the position of Australia and Australia itself as a country, as a state, has very much a big impact on Papua New Guinea's development. politically and economic development. Okay? And it still does today. We cannot fully understand the story of Papua New Guinea without understanding the history and the relationship of Australia. So again here, let's start by looking at 1984. The British declared Papua Protectorate. So the British came in to declare Papua Protectorate because of German influence, okay, in New Guinea Islands, right? And as a result, to protect the British Empire's interest, which is Australia and New Zealand. So that occurred in 1884. By 1888, that status was changed to that of the British colony. So you see, from 1884, 4 years it took to change that status to a British colony. So the Papua region was became a British colony in 1888. From 1888 to 1906, the Papua Protectorate, or Papua Colony, transferred, the British transferred full responsibility to Australia Royal Commission of Inquiry into Papua development. So by 1906, Australia took over, okay, the role of taking care of Papua from Britain. Now this is significant because while that role was taken over from, or passed on from Britain to Australia, Australia was in itself trying to, Australia was in itself trying to negotiate its way in development. 1901, Australia got its political, or let's say independence from Britain. So, while trying to concentrate on developing Australia's own economy, they had another burden to take care of Papua. So you can see the challenge that is faced upon Australia in trying to consolidate and develop its own country as a whole, and at the same time the burden of taking care of another responsibility that is passed on by Britain, that is Papua. That is why some literatures would say that Australia followed a very uninterested colonial tone. But we cannot blame the Australians for this, okay? If you look at it, we were forced into the international political scene by British, and then in the space of, let's say, 10 years, the British then forced that responsibility to Australia. 1914, 1918, World War I affected Papua's, any sort of development in Papua region. Okay? By then we have 230 plantations, 11,000 indentured workers, and then outbreak of war, and then affected commodity prices. By then there was some agricultural activity in Papua, but came 1918, World War I, that halted or stopped growth of any, commodities or plantation or export. And then you have 1918 to 1930, where you have the economic depression also affected any economic development in Papua region. Okay? So first we've talked about the economic or structural impediments. Okay, now we've talked about the political impediments. So the Papua region was, very much strangled by both political and economic forces. And lastly, the Australian mercantilist system. Now, what is this Australian mercantilist system? I think okay. So what is this system here? The Australian mercantilist system. You have 1901, you have Australia, becoming independent from Britain. Now that sets the foundation for this Australian mercantilist system. Now this system talks about protecting Australia's interest within the region. So any economic investments that will one way or the other threaten Australia's interest, okay, would have to be done away with. So Australia said, or during the time, there were certain multinational companies, okay, that were sponsored by the Australian government or the state of Australia. Steamships, Benz Phillip. Now these companies were given special authority and privileges in engaging in the economic affairs within the region. Okay? Meaning that they were protected from tariffs, they were protected by government laws to do business. So any companies that is not of Australian origin, okay, that will be a force of competition, okay, would have to be, okay, booted out by this Australian mercantile system. Now, examples of this Australian mercantile system, okay, came through various laws and regulations. The most notable one was the 1921 Navigation Act. Now, if you look at the reading, and I'll talk about the act a little bit later, but if you look at the reading, you would notice that the Australian administration has instituted various laws. Okay? Remember, any laws or any regulation is an example of a statement of power. So, for example, to consolidate and strengthen the Australian mercantilist system, one such law would be the Native Plantation Ordinance Act or Taxation Act, which requires Papuans to earn cash from wage and labor of set number of days. Now that 1918 or the Native Plantation Ordinance Act was trying to make the territories self-sufficient, because back in the days, our village people were so confined with their traditional obligations that there is no need for them to come out and earn a, let's say, paycheck. Why would you earn a paycheck if you have your, let's say, if you have already readily made food from the environment? Now, why is this act important? Because this act of you to have a wage, okay, will ensure that you pay taxes to the government. And that way the colony or the territory can generate revenue or income, okay? And the other example is the New Guinea Development Syndicate or Long and Company, I believe, yes. Okay. Oh, brother. I'll talk about the Navigation Act and give it significance. By 1921, the Navigation Act here barred any Australian vessels from transporting the produce from colony, imports and export, shipped via Sydney. Any other shipping vessel, foreign shipping vessel that come to, let's say, trade in the Pacific or especially in the Bismarck Sea or the region, would have to report to Sydney. Now, why is this important? So that the 1921 Navigation Act stopped any form of export from Papua or New Guinea. So any export that will come from or generated from Papua or New Guinea territory would have to go to Sydney and then go to the world market. In that relationship alone, it's very costly for any business to operate because of cost of shipping freight. Okay, the prices of getting those goods to Sydney and then to the world market. So it will be expensive to do business in Papua or New Guinea territory. That is the impact of what the 1921 Navigation Act did on the economies of Papua and New Guinea territory. even here in 1915, before the HEC was formed, there is this sentiment of protecting Australian businesses over other foreign businesses coming into the region, especially in territories of Papua and New Guinea. So the syndicate here, Long Handle Company, wanted to establish a trading rights or trading shipping in the region, but was phased out by the stiff competition by Benz Philip and Steamship, which were supported, okay, by the Australian government. By 1925, the Australian Mercantile or the Navigation Act was withdrawal of that act, but it had already caused significant damage to the country's economy in terms of export and import, as far as export and import is concerned. So instead of having foreign companies coming in and investing in Papua region, you have only Australian-based companies here. Now that is not healthy for any investment or any growth. If you're coming from an economic background, you would see that competition in economics is essential for economic growth. When you have monopoly over, so you see, Australian mercantile system is an example of Australia's monopoly over the economic development in both Papua and New Guinea, dictated by Australia's interest. Okay, now let's look at, okay, we have about 20 more minutes. Let's look at New Guinea, okay, up to the 1940s, classical economy, or classical colony, rather. So if you look at the reading, there are three important themes that you will come across. Number one, you will read about the strong interest from Germany, okay, establishing the classical colony. Number two, you will see the challenges. The chapter will tell you or talk about the challenges affected the plantation growth in the New Guinea Islands. And again, after the 1918, the same forces, the Australian mercantile forces, affected the plantation colonies in New Guinea. Now, as far as the center periphery argument is concerned, in the previous slide, I showed you that Papua, in the center periphery arrangement, Papua is ultra periphery, existed outside of the relationship. This was not the case for New Guinea. Germany had a strong, genuine interest to develop New Guinea. One of the reasons was that Germany was the latecomer in terms of colonization and as far as the idea of primitive accumulation is concerned. So here, Germany wanted to have a genuine, let's say, relationship with New Guinea. And that is, in a way, set up by the New Guinea Company on the island of New Britain and New Ireland, and okay, coming towards the Momase region. So there was a genuine interest there. Now, that genuine interest came in the form of establishing a New Guinea Company in the 18th century. Okay, Germany wanted to have monopoly over the region. Okay, just like what the Australians wanted to do. Germany wanted to have a strong economic presence in the northern part of New Guinea. So during 1883 to 1901, that interest was showed through what is called the land speculation. Interested in buying of land, in investing of land. Okay, so Germany started to sell out lands to white settlers. Okay, trying to attract the white settlers to come in and invest in the land, okay, especially agriculture. Okay, in Papua territory, you did not see that. You saw gold prospectors coming in. Okay, in Germany, up to 1940s, they call it the land speculation. They started to sell lands or trying to attract settlers to come in and invest in the agriculture plantation. By 1883 to 1901, we saw the creation of plantation, okay? Plantation economies in both New Ireland, okay? There's an example of plantations in New Ireland and New Britain. So there is an actual development of, let's say, plantation crops like tobacco, coffee, cocoa, okay? And also brings with it other subsidiary companies of German, okay? Or German companies. By 1907, you have the introduction of the head tax. Again here, like the native ordinance tax in Papua territory, German also wanted to have a head tax. And this is important. When you have, okay, taxation is tax is very important for, okay, most of, or not every country, Papua New Guinea included. The idea of taxation is that it generates internal revenue, okay, generates cash. So that same tax is being used to pay for your education, infrastructure, roads. So the idea is to build some sort of sufficiency, okay, to make it independent. By 1899 to 1907, so the increase of cultivation. So basically, increase of cultivation talks about increase of plantation, okay, commodities. The planting of cocoa, copra, coffee, tobacco, okay. So increase in cultivation saw an increase in plantation activities from 1899 to 1907. And then by 1914 saw the full establishment of what is called the classical plantation system, where you have the establishment of station, okay? Plantation system, establishment of stations, meaning that establishment of small township. You can see, if you go to East New Britain, New Ireland, and even West New Britain, you can see some remnants of those plantation systems, of plantation infrastructure, okay? But here, what I'm trying to say is that there was a genuine interest in, okay, by the Germans in investing in the plantation economy in New Guinea. Now that interest was met by various challenges. And the challenges was, okay, the constraint or the shortage of labor. Although German had the capital, or New Guinea company had the capital, they had the technology, but they need the laborers to work on those plantations. And that is where, okay, the challenge or the issue that the German company or the New Guinea company during the time faced. Now what they did was in 1890, they imported Malays, okay, imported indentured laborers from Malay, Javanese, Chinese from Singapore to work on tobacco, coffee, and cocoa plantation. Okay, so now we have some, okay, we have people like Sir Julius Chan, okay, Papua New Guinea's Prime Minister, who, okay, came through this, okay, is part of this legacy, sorry. Okay, so because of shortage of labor, they had to recruit, okay, indentured laborers from this region. By 1896, the companies or the plantation had to abandon tobacco, coffee, and cocoa. Why? Because of high or extreme high death rates of those indentured laborers. Now that affected the cultivation of, okay, agricultural commodities in New Guinea Highland. And also affected the business growth of New Guinea company and its establishment in New Guinea. So by 1899, the New Guinea company was freed of its obligation, meaning that because of shortage of labor, they did not make enough profit, they had to downstream, okay, relieve some of their establishment, and then we saw a small establishment of what is called a subsidiary companies operating, okay, small scale. So their plan to do up a large-scale plantation system was cut short by the issue of labor. So they had to resort to small-scale agriculture, cultivation. So by 1907, small companies, New Guinea Company, mainly operating as corporate traders, were successfully with New Guinea. By 1907, we have small companies operating, and New Guinea Company now becoming a trader. Okay, so those small companies sell to the New Guinea Company, and then New Guinea Company export. That's by 1907. So here, although there was strong interest, but the issue of labor affected, okay, the plantation economy in New Guinea. And again, the Australian mercantilized system. By 1923, 1918, we know World War I, German was defeated, and so all the German territories was broken up, given to the Allies, and as a result, the territories was left under the Australian administration. Again, what was happening in Papua now, okay, was happening in New Guinea. By 1923, the Expropriation Board followed the end of World War I, transferred all authorities and all of German's establishment to the Australians. Okay? So the Australians took over German territories and the thriving plantation economy. By 1926, properties were sold to Australian soldiers with no expertise, experience, and lacking capital. So most of this plantation was sold to most of these Australian soldiers who took part in the war as a token of appreciation, okay, of their time in the world wars. However, that also affected the plantation economy, where you have inexperienced people now administering the plantation in New Guinea Islands. By 1929, properties acquired by Australian oligarchs. So big companies were coming in and taking over the properties that were once belonging to the Germans and administering those properties. Okay. Also, by that time, the economic depression ruined many small planters, and properties fell into the hands of W.R. Carpenters, Benz Philip, and steamships. They were what is called the oligarchs during the time. Post-1929, preferential treatment of imports. Rubber were given priority over coconut, so not to rival Australian manufacturing industries. I'll speak a little bit about this preferential treatment. It's still, if you read around the news when it comes to economic trade, we have this idea of preferential treatment. Now, I'll give you an earlier example on the sugar industry. Now, if you have a thriving sugar industry in Queensland, there is no need to have another sugar industry in Papua. Okay, that will affect sugar industry in Queensland. So the way preferential treatment is used is that, okay, in Queensland, there is no land, no space, let's say no land to cultivate rubber. So what you do, okay, you push the cultivation of rubber to Papua, and then you plant rubber here. We have a lot of rubber plantations here, right? That is an example of preferential treatment. If you are producing coffee in Australia, that's in Queensland, there's no need to have another coffee plantation in Papua or in New Guinea Islands. So preferential treatment was established, or let's say instituted. Now, in that kind of environment of preferential treatment, okay, that will affect, okay, any growth in the agricultural sectors. Why are we importing chickens then rather than growing our own chickens. It's because of this preferential idea here, preferential treatment here. Our government, not our government, but the structural foundation of Papua and New Guinea had made it in such a way that Papua New Guinea now becomes dependent so much on imports than exports. The import-dependent economy that we are experiencing today is because of these structural issues that is discussed here. And chapter 2 talks about this. So preferential treatment. The government wanted to stop the importation of chickens, but they found out that the demand of chickens in Port Moresby and in Papua New Guinea has exceeded. Over time, we have been used to this idea of import dependency. And import dependency came about as a result of these structural issues in our country. So this is not in a way that we will blame the Australians or blame anyone for that, but this is how Papua New Guinea, the structural foundations were built. Okay? That is why your government will need, or our government, sorry. That is why the government will need foreign currencies. Why the need for foreign currencies is to buy off, or foreign currency is needed to offset the import-dependent economy that we have. You cannot buy Papua New Guinea, use Papua New Guinea kina to buy Australian products. You'll have to trade Australian products with US dollars, for example. In an import-dependent economy, you will heavily rely on foreign reserve, okay, to address the import-dependent issue. Now, we have not become independent, economic independent, is because the foundations for agricultural development was not properly established. Okay, but we'll talk about that when we look at the state of affairs from 1945 to 1978 in our next lecture on Thursday. But to conclude, characteristics of a plantation economy. There are 5 characteristics. If you read through the chapters, you will come across these 5 characteristics here. In a plantation economy, you will see that it discourages capital accumulation. Now, in a plantation economy, in the reading, capital accumulation meaning that any money that is generated internally goes overseas. Okay? When you have your first paycheck, what you do, you will go to Big Rooster or go to Phone House and buy your Samsung Galaxy. Your Samsung Galaxy is not produced in Papua New Guinea. Okay? So, the plantation economy during that time, and even to some extent in our time, discouraged domestic capital accumulation. Any money that you have will spend on imported goods than export. Then you will ask your government, why are we not encouraging export? Why? Because the basis and the foundations of export-based economy is not established properly. Anyways, secondly, unequal exchange and exploitation. I think I went through that already. Wages and profit generated from production tend to dissipate into import consumption. Very true during those times and very true in our time. That is a result of an import-dependent economy. Number 4, colonial administration derived its revenues from import duties from manufactured goods, and it was unfavorable for industrialization. The colonial administration depended heavily on import duties or revenues coming from abroad. Without domestic capital accumulation, they could not invest in any industries in our country or during those times. And second, number 5 is the metropolitan government restrict growth of industries to protect their own. That is the preferential treatment that I've discussed. All in all, the Australian mercantile system is important in understanding the plantation system from 1884 to 1940s. Your reading there, okay, gives you a in-depth detail and discussions surrounding this discussion here. Go and read about it because your quiz will be basically based on these two chapters here. I will post the tutorial questions up. Mr. Sinde, okay, will assist me. What you do is you go through the tutorial questions, okay, and ready for the tutorial class on Friday. With that, class dismissed. See you on test day